Welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety, where we talk about the real issues out on the road, focus on safe driving, and learn industry best practices from your hosts Kenny Ray, Mike Bohan, and Jim Seibert, in the hopes that by driving the line, we get more drivers home safe and sound. This podcast was made possible by Marsh McLennan Agency.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety. Whether you've been with us from the beginning or are joining us for the first time today, we are glad that you're here. I'm Jim Seibert, and today, along with my friends and co-hosts Kenny Ray and Mike Bohan, we'll be discussing this year's Drowsy Driving Prevention Week, which will be held November 5th through 11th. This Drowsy Driving Prevention Week started by the National Sleep Foundation. It's a focused week, and they started it 15 years ago with the goal of helping people get the sleep they need and reduce the number of drivers who choose to sleep or choose to drive while sleep deprived. If you want to get some training materials, some aids that's going to help you, maybe help your staff and fellow workers, you can go to the Drowsy Driving site right there on National Sleep Foundation's website. They've got a tab, loads of things and statistics that are real valuable in demonstrating how this can affect us all in many different aspects of our life, not just at work. So, gents, I have had some doozy road trips in my day, and I've probably been more impaired by drowsy driving than maybe some drunk drivers or inebriated drivers, given the time of day it was when I was pulling those off. Think about my military time. I think about just even in the current work that I've got, tough to call life an interruption because it happens to all of us. But as our day-to-day schedule ebbs and flows and we've got work the next day or we need to get somewhere for work the next day and we really can't hit the road till we're done clocking out, it can get us in a situation where we're driving drowsy and we think we're okay when we hit the road, but then it hits us a little later. Your mission tempo, your operation tempo, all of those things can have a pretty big impact, and it doesn't manifest itself until you're in the middle of it. You guys have any situations, anyone that stands out where you hit the rumble bar and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm driving, that you'd like to share?
You know, guys, we the three of us, and I know not all of our listeners know all of our work habits, but all three of us spend a tremendous amount of windshield time in our jobs calling on clients. I cover all the state of Texas and Oklahoma. Mike's got the entire Midwest, and Jim's got ag clients literally all over the United States. And, you know, the three of us drive 50 to 60,000 miles a year. And clearly we're in four-wheelers. We're not in 18-wheelers. And, you know, that's more than the average person drives, but it's about half what a truck driver drives. I mean, most truck drivers drive about 100,000 miles a year. I mean, every 10 years, they're rolling over 1 million miles. So you imagine the amount of time we spend driving, which is a lot compared to the average motorist, and truck drivers are twice that. And, you know, clearly, and we're unashamedly a trucking podcast. So, you know, the applications we always want to make is to the trucking industry. And so, you know, these drivers are driving a tremendous amount of miles, and they're driving at very odd or erratic schedules because of the way the hours of service regulations are written. And it ends up, you know, and you ask us about stories. I'm going to tell you one real quick, and then because I know Mike's got one that's extremely personal for him, but y'all know I'm a retired Texas State trooper, and I was out working one day, bright, pretty day. I remember it well. It was a very, very pretty day, just a normal weekday, no bad weather or anything. And I was south of Dallas, Texas, and in Ellis County, and I looked up, and there's an 18-wheeler going the wrong direction on an interstate. He is southbound in the northbound lanes. And I was on that same interstate. It wasn't that somebody called me and told me. I saw him. He comes by me. And so I'm going the same direction he's going, but I'm on the correct side of the road. And so I turned my overhead lights on. I had my siren on. I was trying to get his attention. And back then, we didn't have these arresting cables or these Jersey barriers that are in all the medians now. And I just kept flashing my headlights at oncoming traffic because there was traffic coming toward him. And he wasn't speeding. I mean, he was running 45, 50 miles an hour. And back then, the speed limit was 55. It's just the fact he was in an 80,000-pound truck on the wrong side of an interstate highway. And finally, we got to a point where I could see far enough down the road, and there wasn't any traffic coming directly at him. And I accelerated, went across the median, got in front of him, and was able to bring him to a stop. And there's a point about this. I did all of the field sobriety tests to make sure he wasn't intoxicated. I arrested him on the spot. So I searched his truck looking for any kind of narcotics or anything. None of that. And I sit him down and I'm waiting on a wrecker to come out there and get that truck. And I've got him in the front seat of my patrol car. And back then we didn't have computers. We hand wrote all of our tickets, and I'm filling out reports, waiting on a wrecker to get there. And he kept nodding off to sleep, which I'm going to tell you, if you're not in law enforcement, you may not understand the significance of that. He is sitting in a police car with a policeman and he keeps going to sleep. That is very unusual, because when you're encountering law enforcement, anybody on this podcast that's ever been stopped, that it's an anxious situation. And if anything, it makes you alert.
Yeah.
And so he kept nodding off. And I finally just asked him, I said, how long have you been up? And he said, I have no idea. He said, I don't even know what today is. He said, I'm so tired, I can't keep my head up. And I said, why? And he had a sleeper on the tractor. I said, why don't you go to sleep? And he said, they told me I've got to get this load to Houston or I don't have a job. And he said, it's the only way I can feed my family and pay my light bill. And this was in an era when we didn't have, there was an abundance of truck drivers. I mean, there were more drivers than there were jobs. And so he told me, he said, if I don't go, he said, they've got a file cabinet full of applications and they'll simply replace me. Well, I ended up calling the company to let them know where I was having their truck towed to. And I'll never forget this. The owner never even asked about his driver, didn't care. All he wanted to know was, where was that truck and what was he going to be able to do to get a driver there to get that load to Houston? And Mike, and again, I want you to share your personal story because it is so profound. But I think one thing you and I see in the industry is when we find drivers that are fatigued out on the road, that's normally a function of culture back at what I call the mothership, back at the company, that the company is tolerating that, or they're actually encouraging or forcing it, either through forced dispatch or unrealistic delivery times. But there's a systemic problem back at the company when we find fatigued drivers out on the road. Now, every once in a while, it's a one-off. But if you start finding a company that's got fatigued drivers as a matter of core, as a routine course of their business, that is not driver behavior, even though it manifested itself on the side of the road. That's a function of a terrible, terrible, dangerous safety culture back at the carrier.
Agreed. Well, before I share the story that I had for you guys, I want to share just a couple of statistics with you. And Jim, sorry if I'm overlapping a little bit on you here now, but I'm just looking at the National Safety Council's website, and they've got the number that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration estimates every year that there's about 100,000 police-reported drowsy driving crashes every year, and about 800 fatalities with about 50,000 injuries. So 100,000 police reported. Then they state that the study by the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety estimated that there's about 328,000 drowsy driving crashes that occur annually, which is about 3 times what the police reported number is. So there's a bunch of drowsy driving crashes out there. So I want to tell you guys about one that is very personal to me. It happened back in February of 2020. My wife and I were sitting on the couch watching TV in the afternoon, and her phone started ringing. And it was a number that we didn't recognize. And it would ring, so we didn't answer. We don't typically answer phone numbers that we don't recognize. And it rang 2 or 3 times. And we didn't think anything of it. And then my phone rang, and it was the same number. So we knew something was up. But when I picked up the phone, on the other end, I found out that my oldest son had been involved in an accident. So let me set up the scene. My son at the time was in college. He was working at a Menards that had just opened up here in Kirksville. So his shift was 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. that day. The night before, he'd been with some friends, things like that. Probably didn't get a ton of sleep. Got up, got to work at 5:30, had a 6 o'clock shift, worked till 2. He got off of work, went to the grocery store, bought his groceries for the next week, and headed home. So he and a buddy that he was in school with and they'd gone to high school with, they were good friends. They lived out on his dad's farm. There was an old farmhouse out there. It was about 10 miles or so out of town. So after he went grocery shopping, he jumped in his 4Runner and he headed back out to the house, which was a 20 minute drive. This was middle of the afternoon. So it's around 3:30. And you guys saw the pictures that I shared this morning. So he's heading south on a 2-lane blacktop road out in the country. And he got about 300 yards from his driveway. Literally, you guys, these pictures I showed you this morning, you could see where their turnoff was to go to their drive in those pictures. It was just right there. Well, my son was heading south. He fell asleep, crossed over the northbound lane, went through a ditch, hit an embankment, went airborne for 100 feet or so, hit some trees, flipped upside down, and had a pretty significant crash, and really walked away with as one of the lucky ones. He wasn't one of those 800 fatalities out of that 100,000 police reported crashes because he was wearing a seatbelt. And for our listeners, I showed some pictures of this post-accident scene from my son having this accident, and he had one mark on his body from this crash, and that was where the seatbelt cinched up on his shoulder during the impact and during the crash. But the whole thing happened. He was a very, very fortunate young man. He was very lucky, and I'm very, very, very proud of him that he had a seatbelt on. And I told him that. I said, this could have ended differently if you weren't wearing your seatbelt. But the whole thing started because he didn't get enough sleep. He was extremely tired. And as he was going home, he almost made it home, was probably letting down a little bit, knowing he was almost there, had a significant crash because he was drowsy. He just flat out fell asleep. And as a parent, there's two emotions there. One, you're just so thankful that he did have a seatbelt on and that he walked away from that crash. And but the other side of it is we got to sit down and have a conversation because he wasn't impaired. He wasn't, it's not like he was drinking and driving or doing something he wasn't supposed to do. He fell asleep. So we had to have that conversation. It's like, bud, that's a dangerous thing. If you're tired, you can't push through that. If you're so tired, you're falling asleep, like Kenny, like that driver you stopped. If they're so tired, they can't keep their eyes open. You can't just push through that. Right. You've got to stop. You've got to get rest. And if that means, you got to pull over and take a nap in your vehicle, even when you're just 15 miles from home, you better pull over and take a nap in your vehicle because it can have some serious consequences. So we were fortunate. We were the lucky ones. Our kid walked away from a very, very serious crash, but you don't want to be in that number where they don't. And this drowsy driving is a serious thing that we're talking about here. So I'm glad we're talking about this, Jim. I'm glad we're bringing this topic up and we're just sharing some good information on how to prevent this and the seriousness of it. Because I don't think we talk about it. I mean, Kenny, I don't know. Do we talk about this enough in the trucking industry? I mean, there's so many regulations out there that we're talking about, the do's and don'ts. We can do this, can't do that. Are we talking about this enough? I don't know.
Think so. And Mike, we this whole idea is really about fatigue management and driving drowsy. And I know we're going to yield to Jim and let him share some more stats and some available resources. But, trucking companies tend to focus on the hours of service regulations, which is just one part of this. What they really need to be focused on is how do we manage this fatigue issue with our drivers? Because we have men and women driving fully loaded trucks up and down the highway that are just as impaired through fatigue by being sleepy as if they were. Analogies have been made as to what level of a BAC that would equate to if they'd been drinking. And so, but the effect is the same. We've got somebody that is literally unable, not that they're choosing, they literally are unable to safely operate that vehicle because the biology of their body has reached a point where basically the brain says this: if you're not going to go to sleep, I'm going to make you go to sleep.
I'm going to put you to sleep.
That's right. And you said a profound, if people don't hear anything else off of this podcast, you made a profound statement, and it was this: you cannot push through that. At some point, the brain's going to say, enough, I'm tired, we're going to sleep.
Yeah, there's no stopping it. And you mentioned something, and Jim, I'm a yield to you, but there's just, when he mentioned that impairment, I'm looking at those stats I was talking about. It says driving after going more than 20 hours without sleep is the equivalent of having a blood alcohol content of 0.08, which is the U.S. legal limit. Truck drivers 0.04, that's their mark, for a positive. But think about that: 20 hours. 0.08 is a serious deal.
We put people in jail for that.
I was going to say, you're going to handcuff somebody, take them to jail for it, but you can go more than 20 hours without sleep, and it's the same thing as far as how it affects your body.
Absolutely.
This might be a younger generational thing, but you guys might not know this term, is what I'm meaning by saying this. But you guys have straight hijacked my thread of this podcast. You stole all my statistics, my key points, and
come on, brother, we love you, man.
I'm so thankful that you did, because in the process of doing it, you brought up some really good other talking points that are completely off script of what I had talked and thought that we were going to cover today. And so let's just bring in a taboo theory that we've been fighting for years, and that's the toughness and just the raw will to get it, to make it happen, to get the job done, to deliver the load. And when we've got a mentality like that, a culture like that within our company, Kenny, we wind up with exactly what you described earlier. Hey, you got to get this done. I don't care what it takes to get there. And we're all hoping that we're years past that guys like you and I have been able to have an effect on the industry and show that the safety and a safety culture, safety mindedness, and proper training is actually, it's a financial benefit. It's a contributor versus an inhibitor of production and delivery. And so I'm thankful that we did take a left turn at Albuquerque there and really expanded some of your thoughts. For the listeners here, I want you to save this particular podcast. If you want to find some interesting stats, go back and listen to what Mike just shared, those stats, because I'm going to share a survey, and you're going to see here that the stats that he shared from the National Safety Council versus this privately conducted survey, they're drastically different. So 95% of Americans think drowsy driving is risky, but a majority of the drivers do it anyways. Why do you think that they would do it anyways? Do you think that they're handcuffed in the plans of the day? Do you think that I've got to get it done or I'm going to be replaced? 6 out of 10 drivers, so that's 62% actually, have driven a car when they were so tired that they had a hard time keeping their eyes open. That's a projected 150 million motorists per year. 37 million motorists are estimated to drive drowsy at least once per year. Almost 2 in 10 drivers, around 18%, are overly confident in their ability to drive after sleeping only 2 hours or less the previous night. Only 2 hours. And then finally, drivers that get 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night are less likely to drive drowsy. So, Kenny, you touched this. We're a trucking podcast. That is our function. And we are all aware of driver's logs and the hours of service rule. But the following rules, they don't necessarily mean you've managed your fatigue well. So since we're freelancing today, if I asked you guys, what do you think that managing your fatigue well, what does that mean to you?
I think when we're talking with trucking companies about fatigue management, you can't take out the aspect of that regulatory part of it, because we're going to have the hours of service in it. So that's going to be an aspect of it. But I think the fatigue management part of it is going to be a lot more communication between the drivers and the folks that are managing those drivers. Because you can be completely within the guidelines of the regulatory requirements, Part 395, hours of service, all looks good, all that stuff. But your weekend was long. Maybe you're remodeling your house, or maybe, whatever. Does your company know that? Do the people that are dispatching you know that? Well, if they don't, so there's a communication aspect of this that goes both ways. The drivers need to communicate that. The carrier needs to communicate to the driver what their expectations are, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, that culture of, hey, we're not going to expect you to do something that's unsafe. And it doesn't matter if it's because you were driving a lot, or if you come in and maybe you've been off, but you're tired. If you're fatigued, our expectation is that you're not going to get behind the wheel of the vehicle. And that's, when we talk about those statistics we were talking about before, it's like, that's a dangerous combination. You put somebody that's extremely fatigued, extremely tired behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, disastrous things can happen. So I think it's a culture thing. And I think there's the first aspect of it, at least that I would hit on, is there's got to be really, really good communication between the drivers and the company, and to make sure that we're being as safe as we absolutely can. And we got to let those drivers know, Jim, some of the things you were talking about there, that from that survey, there's probably truck drivers in that survey, and it's like, you've got to understand that if you are fatigued and you're coming into work, you may be all zeroed out on your hours, and I'm ready to go, but man, you're not ready to go. You're tired, you're fatigued, and everybody's got to be okay with that. And we've got to be able to communicate that and talk about that in a way that is really everybody's on the same page, and there's a good understanding of why we're doing this. This is a safety thing. So that's the first thing I would throw out there, Kenny, is just good communication.
Yeah. And, we've talked on previous podcasts about the importance of policies. And I think the company's got to have a policy about what they're going to do. But if ever there was a time where the policy has to be authentic, and what I mean by that is, it's not just a piece of paper and a stupid manual that's parked on a shelf somewhere. It's got to be that the drivers truly understand that if they're tired, if they're fatigued, if they're sleepy, they can go to their boss, they can go to their supervisor and say, boss, I can't go today. I'm wore out. And there's got to be that openness with it. And it's what Mike talked about, the communication, but it's got to be authentic to where the company genuinely cares about the safety of their driver over the operational aspects of getting that load delivered. I'll tell you all very fast, but a quick story. Before I came to work for MMA, I was the safety director at a large hazmat tanker outfit, and still love it. I'm an old tanker hazmat guy. That's my background. I love it. And we had 21 terminals, and I was at one of the terminals one time doing an in-house audit, and I was visiting with the terminal manager, and a driver came in. And he walked by and he went to the driver's lounge, and he was getting him a cup of coffee, and he was getting his bills, and he was getting ready to go out. And the terminal manager, we were talking, he said, hang on a minute. He said, I got to take care of something. And the terminal manager got up and followed that driver. And I just stayed where I was in the terminal manager's office. And he was gone about 10 minutes. And then he came back, and I saw that driver walk right back through the terminal, and I was sitting by a window. He went out and got in his pickup and drove off. And the terminal manager said, when he came in, I could tell something was wrong. And he said he's been at the nursing home all weekend. His mama's in hospice, and his mom's fixing to pass away, and he's had no rest. And he said he is always laughing and cutting up. And he said when he came in, he said, I could tell something was wrong. And he said, I told him to go home and get some sleep. And it wasn't because the man's mother was dying. It was the fact that the man had been awake basically for 48 hours sitting with his mama at a nursing home, and he was fatigued. and he was fixing to get in a hazmat tanker truck and go down the road and deliver a load. And the point I'm making about this is a terminal manager and a driver had enough of a relationship and an openness that the terminal manager felt comfortable going talking to him. The driver was comfortable enough to be honest with his terminal manager, and the terminal manager told him, you go home and get some rest, then come back and we'll get that load delivered. It ain't a problem. That's the kind of culture we have to have. And we're talking about managing fatigue. That's over and above hours of service. In terms of Federal Motor Carrier Safety regulations, that man was completely legal, 100% legal to get in that truck, but he was absolutely incapable of safely driving that truck up and down a highway, and a terminal manager recognized that, stepped in. It was not a disciplinary issue. He stepped in because he cared about his guys. And that's the kind of culture we've got to cultivate if we're going to do something about fatigue management.
That's pretty excellent. Communication, knowing your employees, in some cases empowering your employees to be able to call that full stop and share. I think that ultimately those are keys to success and keeping drowsy drivers, our employees, off the road if they need to be, and getting more rest before getting behind the wheel.
And Jim, you just mentioned full stop. So many companies are proud that they'll have a stop work authority program. And, they'll tell their drivers, if you ever see something dangerous, you have the right to stop work. It'll be this, they'll put on their fake voice and this is a wonderful thing. We have stop work authority. I rarely see motor carriers say, guess what? Our stop work authority extends to driver fatigue. If you're not rested enough to go, or you see a brother or sister driver that's not rested enough to go, guess what? You have the authority to step in and say, hey, partner, you don't look like you're ready to go down the highway. Let's talk. And my point is, we've got to get to the point. I think there's enough indicators out in our industry that a whole lot of these fatigue driving situations could be nipped in the bud if either we were bold enough, or we had open enough communication, like Mike said, or we were comfortable enough intervening, not from a disciplinary standpoint, but truly from an altruistic standpoint about caring about our fellow employee. And not only is it dangerous to the motoring public for these drivers, it's dangerous to our coworkers. We don't, just like the two of y'all, I love y'all like brothers. If I ever thought y'all were so fatigued y'all shouldn't be in a car, I'm going to say, hey, man, you don't need to be driving. And I'm doing it not to get on you. I'm doing it because I love you. I don't want anything bad happen to you. And I'd love to see more of that in our industry. Drivers tend to look out for each other, with one exception, and it's this. They'll let another driver go down the highway fatigued. And it goes back, Jim, to what you were talking about a while ago. It's that overconfidence truck drivers think, and it goes back to what Mike said earlier, I can push through that. I can push through that, and they can't. At some point, it's pure biology, and the body takes over and says, lights out. It's time to sleep. I've had enough.
Jim, I think this topic, like I said at the beginning of this, when I said, I don't know that our industry talks about this enough. So I'm hoping that the folks that are listening to this, it cultivates some conversations within their companies with their folks, because I agree, Kenny. I just don't think this is happening. I don't think that drivers out there, I don't think that companies, I don't think they're even thinking about this, that it should be a topic of conversation. Not just a topic of conversation, but as you said, Kenny, there should be some action to it. If there's a problem somewhere and we need to say something to one of our coworkers or something like that. So I love this conversation, and I think it's something that we need to talk about more and more and more. Our listeners out there, you all need to talk about it amongst yourselves. And as us three here, as we're talking to our clients and we're out there traveling and meeting with motor carriers, and I think it's something that should get a lot more playtime, when we're having conversations with folks. I firmly believe that.
And Mike, you mentioned the National Safety Council. Jim, I'm going to punt back to you, but I'm going to make a request before I do. Will you share with our listeners one more time either the website or where they can go. Because one thing that I hope will come out of this podcast is that safety directors, owners of small trucking companies, whoever it is at a motor carrier that deals directly with drivers, there are resources out there available for you. National Safety Council has it. Jim's going to share with you a website. I think of the National Sleep Foundation, but he's going to share. But I want to encourage our safety directors and our folks that deal with drivers. If you're a terminal manager, if you're a dispatch manager, a driver, a senior certified driver trainer, if you're dealing with drivers, please get some resources. Realize there's a week set aside in November to focus on this, and make you a plan of how you're going to do some dedicated training just to have open dialogue, unfettered conversation with your drivers about the reality of this entire issue. And you don't have to rely on your own experiences or your own knowledge. It doesn't have to be anecdotal information. There's actually some very good resources out there for you in terms of training material that you can use in a driver safety meeting, a toolbox talk, whatever it is you want to call it. And so if you don't get anything else out of this podcast, just know there's some materials out there. You can get them. You can share it with your drivers and leave them with that idea that Mike shared with them earlier. They can't push through this no matter how big, how tough, how strong, how masculine they think they are. At some point, the body's just going to say enough's enough and I'm done. So, Jim, I'll quit talking, but whatever you do, wrap up. Would you remind our listeners how they can get access to those materials you were talking about, please?
Yeah, Mike, you want to share that National Safety Council website?
Yeah, that what I've got up here is it's www.nsc.org/road/safety topics. And then there'll be a category for fatigue drivers, and we'll put a link in with the podcast, but it's on that National Safety Council website. Good information there, a lot of statistics, things like that. And as Kenny said, there's resources there. When you talk about a fatigue management program, there's a lot of tools there for you to create a program that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I highly recommend you check that out.
Yeah, and the website I'll send in to get linked as well is www.thensf.org/drowsy driving prevention. Most of the notes that I prepared today was based right off of that website. They've got excellent resources. And they've got 3 tips for during daytime hours, how to prepare for driving, and 3 tips for actions to be taken nighttime hours. And they're very, very applicable. And we know that life gets in the way and schedules get disrupted. A best practice that I like to do is really try to adhere to at least 3 of them prior to hitting the road and looking at that. Okay, actions 48 hours out, actions 24 hours out. One thing I do not waver on, one thing that I never substitute out of those list of 6 is maintaining my hours of sleep prior to a road trip. So to our listeners, if you need any additional information, please reach out to your trusted risk consultant. In the next episode of Driving the Line, we're going to discuss how the holiday season can be enjoyed safely. Until then, for my co-hosts, Mike Bohan and Kenny Ray, I'm Jim Seibert. Stay safe and thank you for joining us on Driving the Line, the podcast that's always in the pursuit of safety.
That's all the time we have for this episode of Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety. We hope you enjoyed our discussion and thank you for listening. You can rate, review, and subscribe to Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or any other app you're using. You can also follow Marsh McLennan Agency on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks again for listening. Drive safely, everyone.